Welcome to Upgrad's Masterclass on how to manage and improve team dynamics. So while we give a little bit of time for the rest to join us, please let us know from where are you joining us today. Okay, I can see that some people is joining us from Philadelphia. I myself am based in Singapore. I know there's people joining us from India. Where else are you joining us from? Please share with us in the comments. You just woke up, is it? Everybody seems very quiet today. What's going on? Come on, don't be shy. Oh, Belize, nice. Nice, Amanda, welcome. Bangladesh, wow, we have a very international audience today. Qatar,
Wow.
Vietnam, London, Sydney, wow, okay. Abu Dhabi, exciting. So different timings, huh? For Jeb is morning, for me is night, for some of you is the middle of the day. Wow, Bahrain, Liberia, Angola, Indonesia, great. Thank you so much for joining us, whether it is your morning, night, middle of the day. I'm just really, really happy to know that you're here with us today on how to manage and improve team dynamics. As you might already know, and if not, let me share with you for the first time. Upgrad is a global education technology company that helps working professionals upskill while they work. As your lifelong learning partner, we support your career growth through frictionless learning, offering online, flexible, portable, as well as affordable upskilling opportunities that help individuals remain future ready. With over 2 million learners from more than 100 countries. We are a proven provider in the education space, and we also partner with more than 300 universities globally, representing the top 1% to offer the best of global practices to our learners. At Upgrad, we have a ready pool of global subject matter experts, like the one that is joining us here with us today, who bring the best industry practices from across the globe. Upgrad really takes pride in transforming people who transform businesses and support businesses to transform their people. Our guest today is none other than Dr. Jeb Hurley, a behavioral scientist and leading expert in team dynamics. Jeb blends neurobiology, psychology, and technology to improve leadership, team effectiveness, and create high trust, agile cultures. Jeb's leadership experience includes multiple founder, CEO, and global Fortune 100 VP GM roles, and over 30 years of developing teams and coaching leaders. Jeb holds a doctorate in organizational leadership, is a mentor for TechStarts Foundation, and is also a member of the Institute of Coaching at Harvard Medical School, and is the author of 2 books on team dynamics and leadership. Jeb, welcome to our masterclass. We're excited to have you here with us today. Personally, I'm really excited, so thank you so much for accepting the invitation.
Maribel, you're so welcome. It's my privilege, and I look forward to our conversation as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So how about before we start, we run a poll to see how many leaders are joining us today. Shall we run a poll? CD.
Fantastic.
Please share with us, are you an individual contributor or a team manager? Very good. I see that people is answering very fast. Seems that it's 50-50 so far. 63%. Okay, now 59% are individual contributors. So it's a good mix, and 39% are team managers. Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing with us. So with that in mind, Jeb, let's start with a fundamental question. Why are teams so important today?
That is a fundamental question, Maribel. Of course, teams have always been important, right? You can go back through the entire history of the human race, and groups and whether you call them a group or a team, a tribe, they were important. And they're important for a lot of reasons that revolve around just our need for connection and protection. It was a way to ultimately societies developed. But in today's organizational world, where, beginning in the 90s, with a lot of process reengineering and flattening of the organization, teams became more of the primary way in which organizations looked to innovate and become more agile in the way in which they operated. And so today, that structural change and to some extent behavioral change is what's really amplified the importance of teams and organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. But is there a common foundation to highly effective teams?
The answer to that is yes. But it's not what you tend to read in, sort of the thousands of articles and books and there's a lot of points of view on leadership and on teams. In my work and research and decades of actually sort of dealing with the dysfunctions of teams as well as teams that worked well, and I contributed to both. What I found is that the common foundation has much more to do with something that's very human, and it revolves around the need for when a team's going to operate together, a group of humans together, the need for trust is crucially important, because without that, you will never actually come together as an individual into a group. Then what has kind of going back to really Amy Edmondson at Harvard really popularized, and there was work Robert Kahn before that and a number of individuals back in the 60s of psychological safety. And so that and psychological safety is distinguished from trust in that trust is between you and I. It revolves around my expectation of a positive experience when I'm vulnerable with you. Psychological safety is very much around the group dynamic. So for instance, we can have, and you see this in middle school, particularly, and having had a daughter, it's the mean girl syndrome. Somebody's your best friend when you're playing by yourselves. And yet when you get into a group, suddenly that someone becomes, you're an outsider and they're an insider, and the dynamic changes. And that, we're somewhat wired for that as humans for a lot of different reasons. So trust, psychological safety, and then just the need for strong connection. So those are the common foundations of a highly effective team. There's a high level of trust. There's an understood level of psychological safety, whatever that might be for that team. And there's strong relationship connections that feeds the soul.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, there's so much advice on how to build teams, what build trust, psychological safety, and what creates strong connections. But why do you personally think that all of these are so important?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because the training, leadership, coaching industries produce incredible volumes of ideas and models and approaches. Some are somewhat unique. Most are just sort of regurgitations of the same sort of things over. And unfortunately, what tends to happen is, because few of the practitioners in training and development and coaching, few of them have actually spent a lot of time doing in significant leadership roles. So if you don't have that hands-on experience, you don't have sort of that really strong gut sense that you do when you're in the middle of trying to deal with a dysfunctional team, or you're leading a team of teams, that trust, psychological safety, and the importance and connection, their importance comes from their deep, very holistic connection to our common neurobiology as human beings. So if you start with, how does our brain really work? How does why are teams important? How does trust actually manifest itself from a neurobiological standpoint? And if you build on that and then say, okay, well then what are our core psychological needs as human beings, particularly human beings at work? Those three elements as a foundation, trust, psychological safety, and connectedness, strong relationships, they're so important because they tap into what is something very, very human in all of us. And there are lots of other things that surround it. There's employee engagement, there's all these other, but those tend to be secondary or derivative measures or indicators of things. Whereas, for instance, trust and the way we experience it, or the way we experience what has been called psychological safety, which is really sort of the way we experience group dynamics, are fundamental to the way in what triggers the best of us or the worst of us. And again, literally from a neurochemical standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, you make it sound so simple, and it sounds like a simple recipe, right? Build trust, create psychological safety, and develop strong people connections. But then what makes that so challenging for leaders?
Yeah, I love that question, because you see a lot of some of the best, sort of the best in TED Talks and things like that. And it's all in trust is a huge topic. But when you get to your question, which is the how question, not the why question, the problem with things like Find Your Why is they're very entertaining. They're very engaging and inspirational, actually. I mean, what I love about people like Dan Pink and Simon Sinek's work is that they are inspirational. People come away saying, wow, that's where I want to be. That's fantastic. But then you're left, then kind of you wake up from the kind of reality distortion and you say, well, how do I actually do that? And the issue is, and the reason that, while, as you said, it sounds simple, but what makes it challenging is that if you look at both the experiences and the learning paths for the vast majority of people who find themselves in leadership roles or just simply part of teams and organizations, very, very few have been trained to tap into that, both the neurobiology and apply the psychology that ultimately engenders trust. So that, well, how do I do that? It's just missing. And psychological safety, again, it's like, okay, I get it as an idea, but how do I really in the day-to-day work where, I've got my boss is pressuring me here, I've got goals to here, I've got infighting going on there. And it's like, seriously, now I've got to step back and figure out how to do this. And so what ends up happening is a lot of the training, a lot of the development tends to really take one just little slice. Well, the answer is growth mindset. Growth mindset's fantastic. Carol Dweck's work is truly insightful and innovative, but by itself, it isn't going to do it. So it's kind of the way medicine is moving in general. It's taking a holistic approach. It's looking at a team and the individuals on that team and an organization as human beings, not just simply we're workers. We're coming in to do a task, and yes, that is part of it. That's why organizations exist, but that doesn't get you there in terms of those really foundational characteristics.
Yeah, especially the connection portion, right? But I mean, after the pandemic, does being a global virtual team operating remotely and, if you add across different cultures, makes leading even more challenging today?
Oh, yeah, of course. And then for all of the leaders, managers on this call that are part of or lead global virtual teams, it got a whole lot more difficult, right? So it started with, of course, just it always starts with just the operating challenges of if we're working via technology, Zoom and Slack and Teams and other ways of communicating, we do lose, not all, but we do lose that element that comes with being in person. And some of it's kinesthetics, body language, some of it is being able to, if you're a manager or you're a leader and you have a team of 7, 8 people, seeing just boxes on a screen, you're not catching a lot of the dynamics that may be going on when person A says something, person B, rolls their eyes or whatever. That's much harder to pick up. And it maybe, in fact, maybe Zoom should add like an eye roll feature where it sends off a little red light. So you have those added distance. And then you combine that with the complexity of cultural differences. So, the way, and this is particularly, I kind of criticize my home culture, America, coming from the West and American culture. And one of the things having had the privilege of living and working around the world and 8 years in Singapore and a couple of years in Japan, is you quickly appreciate how all of the education you have, the MBAs and sort of these are all Western constructs. And you get into, you come to India or you're in Japan or China and people look at you like, what are you talking about? They come from a fundamentally different, you may be coming from a Judeo-Christian perspective. This is coming from a Buddhist or a Confucian traditions, and all of that influence who we are. And so the ante goes up in a big way in terms of being able to understand and be highly effective in those kind of cross-cultural environments. And again, the key is focusing on those. The more you can focus on those fundamental human elements, because trust transcends every culture. Psychological safety, in whatever form that takes for a given team, transcends culture. And so do connections. Those are things that you build beneath what culture is, and then culture informs how those play out in an organization or on a team.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm listening to you, and nowadays everybody's more and more talking about overall well-being, right? So as a leader of a cross-cultural virtual team, what are the most important things leaders can actually do to manage and improve their teams, not only effectiveness, but also their well-being?
Yes, and you're absolutely right. Those two are inextricably tied together. And that is one of the big, and very positive changes, I think, that we're seeing happening in the world of work and, and hopefully the future of work over the last, 10 years, and certainly since the pandemic, just in the last three or 4 years. So the answer to the question, it of course starts with the how do you tap into trust? How do you tap into and build psychological safety and that connectedness on and across teams? Because in most organizations today are a team of teams, not just simply one team operating. And again, it comes back to just as an approach, if you think holistically about us as human beings, and you want to tie, if trust is a fundamental element that has some very strong neurobiology beneath it, and it does, then what you want to do is what's closest to that. And that really falls into 3 buckets. One is really having a good understanding and alignment around purpose. Why am I getting up out of bed today and going to work, and what's going to get me energized? And if I'm a leader, how do I align the purpose of this team and the organization to the individual? Because when you do that, it's kind of like, duh. I mean, it's really powerful when you align those. But then you have to have guardrails, right? Because if I find real purpose in, like parasailing and then, I'm working, it's like, okay, those two don't really align. So you need to have, and this is where the values and norms or behaviors come in. So clarity, and this becomes the North Star for any team and any organization. Clarity of purpose, the values by which you are going to live and guide one another, and the behaviors that emerge from that. That's the North Star that ties deeply into also sort of the way we feel, what we anticipate in the morning when we're coming, we're getting ready to go to work. And the more that you have that clarity around those, around purpose, and you're living the values and norms, you're typing in, and I'll go geeky technical for just 1 second, because most everybody's heard of dopamine. That's pretty common. What most people don't actually understand about dopamine, it's not the mouse, it's not the mouse hit the bar reward. Dopamine in the dopaminergic, what's called the dopaminergic system pathway, is actually an anticipatory. It's the dopamine has its effect when we're anticipating experiences, and then actually that follow through. So it's anticipatory as opposed to a reward afterwards. And that's really important, because when you help people find purpose in their role, where they're going, and invest in them well-being, you're triggering that dopaminergic system that makes people feel good about what's to come. And it's incredibly powerful. So that's number one. The second is that the second most important thing is actually understanding how you motivate people. Sounds simple, but the reality is very few managers or leaders actually understand the mechanism of motivation. And I'm not talking about ping pong tables and little gold stickers and that. It's not that things like that don't have a place, and they do. People do enjoy them. It doesn't trigger the core brain chemistry. So understanding how you move people towards something more intrinsic, something that they own and attach to their identity, is how you ultimately, really motivate individuals. And that's also, and there's the second element which is, do you understand how to enable change? How do you move from pushing people to having them pull towards what it is you want to do that's different than what they either want to do or don't understand why they're doing it. And in organizations, people talk about resistance to change. Well, most of that has to do with the way in which we talk about and present opportunities for change, as opposed to people just being naturally resistant to it, because that's actually psychologically, we're changing from literally from the day we're born. We live change. That is our lives. We resist it when we don't understand it, or when it's presented in ways that feel, that we don't trust, or we don't feel safe with. And then the last is the third element. So we have that ability to align purpose, values, and norms. We've got the motivation and change. And then perhaps the most powerful is learning to see and close gaps between what people expect of us, or we expect of others, and the experience we create or have. And when there are gaps, it's learning to close those gaps. So that would be the third, if I want to really improve both effectiveness and well-being, clarity of purpose, clear values. Do you understand how to motivate at the individual level and talk the language of change? And then, most importantly, because as humans, we're really good at messing up relationships, you got to get really good at closing the gaps. We're wired, actually. Psychologically, we are wired to disappoint when it comes to setting expectations in all of our relationships. And you can track that, from our kids, our significant others, spouses, coworkers. We do it all the time. The key is closing the gaps. So those would be the three.
Thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, absolutely. Like, I always think that change is the only constant. Recently, I was listening to another leader share that the way they motivate and their company culture is all around assuming good intent. So basically, everything that everybody does, they will first assume that they're doing it because they believe it's the right thing. And I think having that really made me wow, because if we all assume good intent from the people that we work with, I think that the relationship would improve a lot. But you were recently, just now you were just talking to us about finding your North Star, right? So understand how to motivate and enable change, and learn to see and close experience versus expectation gaps. Within that recipe, what would you believe is the most important ingredient, and why?
Oh, yeah, good question. Although before I answer that, I want to circle back to your point about assuming good intent, because That is one of the, you're absolutely right. That is one of the most important values. And it is a, as you establish, the values that your team is going to operate by, having that assuming good intent is it really is fundamental, because it's fundamental to trust, psychological safety, and connection. So it hits, when you look at values, what I do when I'm working with a team or an organization, I'll look to say, okay, if here's a value we want to have, fantastic. The most powerful values are the ones that tap into those three foundational elements. The further you get from that, the weaker the value tends to be. And then the trick is having everyone on the team guide and assess one another based on adhering to that value. And that's where things tend to fall down. It's easy to say, assume good intent. Behaviorally, a little more challenging, but it's very powerful. To answer your question, all of those elements are extremely important. But if someone said, well, what's the one that gets you the furthest, quickest? It is that learning to see and close experience expectation gaps. And there's lots of examples that actually in our everyday lives, and if we were in an interactive session, we could jump into some of those with the audience. But I'll quickly relate one experience I had, which was profound for me because it had a high emotional valence to it. Which I had the privilege of having dinner one night with a group of they were Israeli fighter pilots. So it was part of a fighter squadron, and our conversation was, and this was when I was doing my doctoral research, and our conversation was around team dynamics. And this, of course, is team dynamics with a group of people whose lives literally depend on their ability to execute kind of with perfection, right? And what's interesting is and people have, so you have this vision of whether they're like Navy SEALs or the World Cup winners or whatever. I mean, people have an impression of individuals, and then you sit down with them and they're very human. And the squadron leader, he said to me, look, you got to understand, we probably have the biggest egos in Israel. We a pretty funny guy, actually. And he said, and we're human. So we have expectations. I was using that framework, and we mess it up. We have issues. He said, but I'll tell you what, when we walk into before a mission, when we go into the operations room, two things are absolutes. One, there's not an ego allowed in the room. Second, there are no gaps. He said, and it's not because we're perfect human beings. That's far from the case. He said, what we excel at is closing the gaps. Because we won't fly. If there's an issue that's going to get in the way of the success of our mission and put someone's life at risk, and he said, I don't want to be the one that, as a squad leader, I don't want to be the one that has to go talk to, that pilot's mother of why we screwed up and didn't execute. And it was incredibly powerful, because it's like, wow, that ability to close gaps is so fundamental to our relationships, the level of trust we have. And it turns out it is how you build trust ladders in a relationship. So you think about any good relationship you have with someone, and you have an expectation of that individual or those individuals. And when they deliver a good experience, what happens to that expectation? It goes up. And we continuously ladder up until we get to a point where we have a very high level of trust. Now, what happens if you flip that around? When you have high expectations of someone, and what happens when they consistently deliver below that?
Yeah, you miss the trust.
Well, yes, because what's happening is my expectation then drops. And it starts, eventually, my expectation of that individual or that team, that organization will meet that low level of experience. And that is the definition. That is how people just disengage, right? They're done with the relationship. If it's in our personal relationships, we're done with that. If it's in a work relationship, we're usually, it's when people talk about they leave their, they don't leave their job, they leave their boss. Well, that is typically what's happening is, our expectation of the support we're going to get from our manager or our boss, we get disappointed day in, day out. And finally we say, as soon as I'm able to, I'm out of here, because there isn't trust. There isn't, people, there's that, the say-do ratio is low. People don't own their experiences. They blame, it's always someone else's fault. There's a lot of dynamics that come beneath that. But the long answer to your short question is, as a leader, if you can build the habit, that one habit of seeing and closing experience expectation gaps on your team, with you as a leader, it starts in the mirror always. And then within the team, you put that team on the path to excellence every time. And the rest begins to, you can work through the rest of it as you go.
Yeah, that's a very good advice. Thank you for that. And, I would love to continue asking you so many questions, but I would also love our attendees to be able to ask you some questions. So before we proceed to our Q&A, could you give us a quick summary of how you personally manage and improve your team dynamics, taking into account, the different countries that you work with?
Yeah, that's, well, I do walk the talk in terms of, most of my work is with leadership teams, executive teams, as well, or kind of in larger organizations, the leadership team, the executive and his or her direct team. And while it's not there's never a recipe, because we're human, right? Every team has its own kind of dynamics. And one of the things I discovered in big ahas in my research was that culture, in organizational culture, it's a whole nother topic, but that people can make culture very complex and all these, all kinds of elements, and they have all kinds of you can do all kinds of diagnostics. And honestly, at the end of the day, culture is actually very, very simple. Organizational culture. It is the leadership team's behavior at scale. If you look at any organization and the way the executive team behaves, and then you can just trace that through the organization, that people will model the behaviors that the senior most executives, how they behave in the organization. And if they're modeling, the best of the best, that's what you're going to get. If they, the high say, low do, all of the, human frailties, you're going to see that permeate throughout the organization. So with that in mind, going back to find your North Star, whatever that is going to be for this organization, for this team, purpose and values, the behaviors, and most importantly, use it to guide and assess. Values are their most powerful when every member of the team feels comfortable in saying, hey, you really didn't assume good intent. I don't feel like you assumed good intent, when that issue was brought up at the team. And that is so powerful when we have the level of trust and psychological safety that we're comfortable in calling out and holding ourselves and our peers accountable for the values. So that's number one. Learning how do you actually inspire motivation in people? Look in the mirror as a leader and say, wow, can I honestly say I know what gets each of my team members up out of bed and energized every day? Most days. Everybody has bad days, but the point is, do you actually understand that? And are you tapping into that power? And so I have some constructs. One's called the motivational triangle that aligns individual purpose with the team and the competencies you invest in and the autonomy you're given. But there's simple, these psychological mechanisms that tie into our core needs as humans at work. And then how you foster change, the language you use as a leader, it either puts people on the defensive and put their shields up, or can move people towards pulling towards change, and you have everybody sort of rowing in the same direction, rather than everybody pulling an oar slightly different time, and the boat just does this. So that learning that language of change. So that's the second element. And then the third is the one I just talked about at length, which is learning to see and close experience expectation gaps. And that is really, honestly, it's really the key to how you lead and live. Because taking that practice into any aspect of your life will improve it. It's simply, actively listening, really seeing what experience am I delivering, or am I owning the experiences that are coming towards me, versus what are the expectations I have of others or they have of me. And if there's a gap, having the courage to close it. And you will, people, most relationships, most connections fall apart, most trust gets destroyed, and psychological safety diminished because people don't simply close the gaps. So that would be the big three. And it is how it's all of my work, which again is holistic. I not only do I provide those foundations, but I work with the team around the values and norms, but then individuals, because in sort of individual coaching, and then use technology to measure something called trust metrics, to measure the relationship strength at sort of all the key points, so that it's an evidence-based, data-driven. And what I find is kind of like, again, holistic medicine. But when you take the whole team as a whole body together, we're made up of those individual elements, those group elements, those foundational skills, but you got to measure it. If you don't, you're guessing. You just think that you're making progress. You really don't. So that would be that's the approach.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing your insights on, how you manage and how do you make sure that you're improving constantly your team dynamics. Now I'm gonna open the floor to our attendees for them to also get their questions answered. So please, if you have any question, now is the time.
Yes, please.
In the chat, and I'll make sure to ask it to Jeb. Let me see. I can see one question here from Babu Seed. How can I be more confident? How can I be confident?
More confident, and I'm assuming that. So that's a it's a very broad question. I'm going to assume that's sort of as a manager or as a leader. What's really interesting. So confidence, right, which is also known as self-efficacy, how we feel about ourselves, comes actually from, if we go back to what motivates us as humans and at work, the core to confidence is, it actually starts with, do I have clear purpose? Do I really know what I want to do? And where am I at with the skills I need to be able to realize that purpose? Because that combination, I know what I want. This is where I want to go. I want to be an incredibly effective leader. I know that here's what I need to do to be able to improve that. That little dynamic turns out to be an enormous confidence builder in yourself, because it sets up a little flywheel, a little wheel that self-reinforces. The greater I find, the clearer I am on my purpose, the greater the skills I build. Because confidence, right, is not about just me in the mirror. It's me working with other people. It's me going out into the world. When I do that with a clarity of purpose and a good sense of where my skills are and where they're going to be able to realize that, I can approach people and problems and situations with a whole lot more confidence. So it always ties back to those fundamental sort of psychological needs that we have as a human being at work. And when you tie that, your confidence will, and that, and I am not a psychologist. So there can be a lot of other dimensions that go into individual confidence and self-efficacy. But I find that when you help people find that purpose, invest in their skills, and then give them the freedom to do it, their confidence soars. So that's and again, there are many other dimensions to it, so I don't want to make it sound like it's overly simplified, but in the work environment with a team, when you do that with individuals, you will see their confidence grow tremendously.
Thank you so much, Jeb. We have another question here. Why are organizations calling back employees to office even though it worked well working from home?
Yeah, great question. So again, I have seen a fair amount of research on this, and I also have a belief based on my years working as a manager, as a leader in organizations. And my observation is that most of the companies where you see that happening, not all, but most, that the average tenure of a manager or leader, they're probably over 40 years old. And the reason I say that is that anyone who grew up in the more hierarchical, sort of before flatter, teams-based, technology-enabled organizations, they're afraid. Those managers don't know how to lead to motivate and get things done in a remote environment. So their natural reaction is, in order to control people, I have to have them around me. Now, there's the evidence is really non-existent that is true. It's not true. Actually, people can work effectively in many different environments, and we demonstrated that during the pandemic. It's also true that many people have a need for the social interaction, which is why hybrid work has become the go-to for more enlightened organizations. But really, the main reason I believe that you see managers saying people have to be back in the office, it's because they're afraid that they really don't understand how to build an effective team in a remote environment. They've never done it. They've never been trained to do it. And honestly, they're self-interest, right? They're afraid for their job. And so if I can see all my people sitting in their cubes, then they must be working, which of course is ridiculous. Everybody knows that. You can be at work and be doing nothing, and it's just as easily as you can at home. So it makes sense when you think about it from a psychological standpoint and what those managers are afraid of. So that would, to me, that's the core of the why.
About digital transformation there. Okay, we have another question here, which is how to manage difficult team members.
So I'm going to take you right back to the conversation that Maribel and I just had. So the real question to ask yourself is, why am I having to have this difficult conversation? Because if you have a difficult team member, the implication is you're having difficult conversations. So the real question is, why am I having to have this conversation? And most of the time, it's because I, as a manager, actually allowed a situation to I ignored it. I wasn't paying attention to it, and it became more and more toxic over time. So someone became more and more difficult. The key to avoiding that is when you have clear purpose, not only for your team, but when you bring someone into your team, if their job design, their role has what's the purpose of this role and what value does it create? You're setting a very set of clear expectations. And then if you have very clear values around how you're expected to live and behave on this team to do your role, then you as a manager, as soon as there's and there will be, when there's a deviation for that, the minute it happens, you can immediately have a coaching conversation. I'm going to correct this. That's not a difficult conversation. It's Maribel, when you came on board, we talked about how important it was to assume good intent. And that's a value that we really live on this team. The conversation you just had with Robert, with your colleague, with Ash, You didn't actually, you didn't assume good intent. That really doesn't work. So what did I just do? I didn't have to say, Maribel, what's wrong with you? I said, we have a value. This is important. It's important to us as a team. You didn't live that value. I coached, said, Maribel, let's work on that. If it happens again and again, that third conversation is really actually now easy. What do you do with that difficult team member? It's like, wow, the values of the team, the how your role, it's not working. And it's so either the individual has no longer difficult because they're doing their job as you've made it very clear. You've set expectations and know where the bar is. You're helping them get there, clear values and norms. If someone isn't living up to that, then the answer is very easy. They don't belong on your team. And it's really easy to have that conversation as a leader. So it all comes down to that. If you put in place the fundamentals, then the leading or managing the dynamics on that team become way, way easier. Even when there's someone who's difficult, because, okay.
Okay, thank you so much for answering that question. We also had somebody asking you here, is there any value in a leader expressing vulnerability with the team?
Yes, but so here's and I know there's a lot out in the literature today, and the articles and about, be authentic, be vulnerable. And look, there are some absolutely are there elements of kind of fact and truth in that. Yes. However, how you as a leader choose vulnerability is really important, because what's sitting alongside of vulnerability and authenticity is power. And, people look to leaders, for direction. They look to leaders for strength, for, when everything seems to be falling apart, that they are the rock. And so if vulnerability means you're coming in, breaking down, and you are not going to be seen and viewed as a leader. On the other hand, if you seek feedback, if you genuinely, if you share feedback that you've gotten, say from your boss, and you demonstrate vulnerability in the way that demonstrates courage, that you have the confidence to say, hey, this is the feedback I'm getting from my boss around how I can be better. I'm giving that to you because I seek your feedback to ultimately improve as a leader of this team, of this organization. That is vulnerability, and that's incredibly powerful. So the answer is yes, but with a big but, because it is not kind of the sort of, I'm just out there, presenting myself. No, and same thing with authenticity, because again, that's authentic self? Is it you as a parent, you as a friend, you as a boss? You can't show up as a boss like you're a parent. You'll draw your people. That's nuts. They're not children, right? So the idea, it's those things that sound nice until you really think about them and say, wait a second, what if my authentic self is not very pleasant, and I'm not going to people don't want me to bring that to work, so authenticity, vulnerability, yes, but.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that is a very important advice. Somebody else is asking us as well, how to adjust for the impact of race, ethnicity in terms of closing the gap between experience and expectations?
So it comes down to that understanding. And so if we go back to those fundamentals, right? Of understanding what motivates someone, why are they there? You know, what's there? Where do they find purpose in their work? And so it doesn't, you know, race, gender, ethnicity doesn't really particularly matter. We're human beings. And I think from an experience expectation standpoint, it's very much understanding how those, you know, we grow up differently in different, you know, and our gender, our race, our ethnic, those all influence the way we see ourselves in the world. So as a leader, what's really important is understanding the expectations that come with that. And at the same time, you know, you balancing that with the expectations that come with the role that individual is in. Because again, this is a work environment. You know, we're not out in the broader society where there are fewer boundaries around what it means to, you know, to be a member of that society and how your race or your gender, your ethnicity may play into that. At work, you know, we are there, it's a bounded environment. We come to work in exchange for, we bring our skills in exchange for remuneration. In the form of, you know, pay and, you know, of benefits, of perks, of relationships. But you as a leader, you know, that gives you a boundary within which to work, so that you want to understand expectations of and how the experience that individual's having. And if someone is having a bad experience because of their race, their gender, then you've got a real gap to close there. You know, so it comes back to the same dynamic within the bounds of a work environment. The experience someone had, everyone, it's, you know, I should expect to be treated, you know, fairly and equitably, no matter what my race, gender, whatever that is. If that experience isn't happening, I have an obligation as a leader to close that gap. You got to fix that. So that's how I think the DE&I initiatives and where they're strongest is when they're viewed that way, between what is the experience an individual is having versus the reasonable expectation of what they should be having in this work environment. And leaders close the gap.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. This has been a very enriching session so far. So before we finish our session, I would like to also share that Upgrad offers Doctorate of Business Administration programs in collaboration with top global universities. These programs actually help also with team dynamics and can actually provide the tools and knowledge that are necessary for managers to create and manage their teams that are highly effective, collaborative, and productive, those leading to better overall organizational performance, same as what we've been speaking here today with Jeb. So we're going to be sharing the links of our DBA programs in the comments. Feel free to check them out. I know that some of the questions that some of you might not have been answered because of the time constraints. However, please feel free to reach out to Jeb on LinkedIn, connect with him, connect with me. We'll be more than happy to continue supporting you and answering the questions that you might still have. So before we end the session, I really want to thank you, Jeb, for being such an amazing speaker and for sharing so candidly, as well as all our attendees for joining our masterclass on how to manage and improve team dynamics. So we really hope that you find it informative and useful for your professional lives. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you in our next masterclass. Thank you so much for today. And please make sure to connect with Jeb on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Maribel, thank you so much. You're amazing. And I enjoyed it. My pleasure. And again, privilege to support Upgrade and to have joined you on this call. Thank you.
It's been our absolute privilege. Thank you so much. And thank you for everybody that is joining us from all over the world. It's been a pleasure hosting this session.
Yeah, great questions, everyone. Thank you.